In the history of the United States, there was a woman named Louise Preslar Peete who won the hearts of most men with her gentle appearance and elegant demeanor. But in reality, she hid a cold, ugly soul, and the men who approached her died inexplicably, such as by poisoning or shooting themselves. It wasn't until 1920 that a private detective searched her house and uncovered her crimes. It was then that she was revealed to be an extremely cold-blooded killer, robber, swindler, and sociopath. Her charm and lies are her deadliest weapons, and she smiles as she approaches the men who are attracted to her, oblivious to the fact that they are walking step by step to death. Like Latrodectus mactans, the species of spider that eats its mate after mating, she plans each hunt in the shadows, ostensibly for money, but her true motive for murder becomes difficult to decipher after her execution in a California gas chamber. On an unusual Tuesday, September 20th, 1880, Louise was born in Bienville Parish, Louisiana, a place where history and nature intertwine. Known for its rich cultural and natural landscapes of beautiful forests and abundant wildlife. Her father was Thomas Jefferson Preslar, who, according to census records, was a schoolteacher, and in addition to that capacity, he was in the printing business, which was very lucrative at the time. And he was able to send his children to private schools, indicating that his financial status was middle class or above at the time. Their mother was Elizabeth Maria Foster, and although not much is known about her, she was also a very fine woman based on her husband. Thomas, a former teacher, knew the importance of learning and took an elite approach to raising his children, choosing to send them to a private school in New Orleans for their education. When Louise was about 15 years old, she was expelled from school for stealing her classmates' belongings and engaging in inappropriate sexual behavior. There were two possibilities for her to have made these mistakes. The first possibility was because she had originally lived a very comfortable life in her hometown where she had used money to develop complacency. But upon arriving at the private school in the city of New Orleans, she realized that there were many people who were better off and richer than she was. And so she was blinded by the blindness of money and class. The second possibility is that she found theft and inappropriate sexual behavior very interesting, and she indulged in these very exciting behaviors. In 1903, at the age of 23, Louise married Henry Bosley, a traveling salesman, and 4 years later, Henry decided to commit suicide after discovering that Louise was having an inappropriate relationship with an oil worker in New Orleans. I find this act of suicide strange. Louisiana law at that time emphasized the sanctity of marriage, and the divorce laws were quite strict. The grounds for divorce included adultery, desertion, cruelty, and sexual impotence. It just so happened that Louise fit into one of these categories. And if she had gotten a divorce, she would have suffered a lot of scorn in the community. So there's a possibility that this was a way for her not to be subjected to that treatment. And she chose to murder Henry so that she still had access to the upper class and the fact that no one thought she was a bad woman. Another possibility is that she took out an insurance policy for Henry. She was aware that Henry was a devoted man in love and marriage. She understood that he would kill himself if he saw her in bed with another man, which would explain why she liked money so much. Louise then moved to Shreveport and worked as a sex worker for high society clients, stealing property from her clients, knowing full well that these people would not report these thefts to the police for their own glory. In 1911, Louise traveled to Boston, Massachusetts, and changed her name to Louise M. Gould. She created the lie that she was from Dallas, an heiress named Rosley, and that she had escaped from a convent after the family tried to get their hands on her inheritance and put her in a convent. Using this harrowing story and her charm, Louise was able to gain the trust of several wealthy families and convince one to take her in. She then continued to deceive these people by using their money to continue shopping in these expensive stores and stealing money from their friends and employees, saying that she would give them more money when she succeeded in getting her inheritance so that these people wouldn't feel cheated. But the police later found out Louise's real identity, and in order to avoid any embarrassment to these people, she was quietly driven out of Boston. Louise later moved to Waco, Texas, and formed a relationship with a wealthy local oil tycoon, Joe Appel. But just a week after they met, Joe was shot and killed in his home. And at the same time, his precious diamond jewelry disappeared, for which Louise was charged with murder. But during the trial, she claimed that it was Joe attempted rape of her that made her shoot and kill him. And then an all-male jury acquitted her in a bizarre trial in which no one noticed the missing jewelry. In 1913, Louise traveled to Dallas and quickly married Harry Fourot, who worked as a night clerk at the local St. George Hotel. Soon after, Louise was suspected of stealing $20,000 worth of jewelry from the hotel safe, and the police questioned Fourot because he was the only one who had the time to commit the burglary. but instead of linking him to the burglary, they questioned Louise, whom they suspected of being involved in the burglary, but had no hard evidence to link her directly to the crime. Fourot, on the other hand, was extremely embarrassed by the accusation that he was involved in the burglary. He also found his wife in bed with another man. He finally decided to shoot himself, but he ended up in almost the same place as Henry. In 1915, Louise moved to Denver, Colorado, and married Richard Peete, a salesman who worked there. Their marriage produced a daughter, Frances Ann, who was born in 1916. However, the marriage was not a harmonious one, with frequent arguments between the two, and they finally decided to separate in the summer of 1920. For a fresh start, Louise moves to Los Angeles, where she meets Jacob C. Denton, a recently widowed mining engineer who had amassed a multi-million-dollar fortune before retiring with a teenage daughter. Denton was looking for a tenant and was renting his 14-room mansion at 675 South Catalina Street, near Wilshire Boulevard, for $350 a month. And for some unknown reason, he agreed to rent the mansion for $75 a month to Louise, who moved in on May 26th, just a few days before Denton was scheduled to leave. The nature of her relationship with him is unclear. She was considered his live-in girlfriend, housekeeper, and tenant, and she never formally signed the lease. Louise later claimed that a romantic relationship existed between them. On June 2, 1920, just over a week after Louise moved into the mansion, he mysteriously disappeared. Shortly thereafter, she hired a gardener to bring a load of soil to the basement, claiming she was going to grow mushrooms. And on June 5th, she forged Denton's signature, withdrew $300 from his bank account, and opened his safe deposit box. When a bank employee expressed skepticism about his signature, she explained that Denton's right arm had been amputated after an altercation with an angry, mysterious Spanish woman, and that he now signed only with his left hand. She claimed that the anomaly in the signature was due to the fact that she had to help him write the check and sign his name with his left hand, and she later offered several different versions of the story, including one in which the woman had cut off his arm and leg with a sword and said that him had gone into seclusion out of shame over his amputated arm and would only see and speak to her. Over the next few weeks, as his friends, business associates, and neighbors begin to question Louise about his whereabouts, she weaves several stories to explain his disappearance. One of which is that Denton is on an extended business trip to another location and will be back soon. In the meantime, Louise began posing as his wife, squandering his money, driving his Cadillac, pawning his jewelry and possessions, and renting out rooms in his mansion, keeping the rent for herself. Louise also persuaded tenants at his Phoenix, Arizona property to pay her rent, and in August she charged 2 expensive dresses at Brock's department store in Denton's wife's name. Around this time, his daughter hired a lawyer to try to locate her father. The attorney interviewed Louise, but she said she did not know where Denton was, although she agreed to return Denton's financial and business records as soon as possible. Over the next month, she rented out the mansion and returned to her estranged husband and daughter in Denver. With Louise gone, Denton's daughter was finally able to search the premises. On September 23rd, the attorney hired a private investigator to search the house, and he found his decomposing body buried in a wooden compartment under the basement stairs. An autopsy determined that he had been shot in the head and strangled. The police then tracked down Louise and questioned her about his murder. She says that the unidentified and mysterious Spanish woman who shot him and caused his arm to be amputated was the murderer. But this theory is quickly dismissed when his body is found with his right arm still intact, and Louise then claims that the body was not his. Rather, it was the body of a double he had killed. She was returned to Los Angeles and charged with first-degree murder, and her trial began on January 21, 1921. Louise's trial became the focus of the nation's newspapers, especially the Hearst newspaper system, known for its sensationalism and yellow journalism, which covered it extensively. Thousands of spectators lined up each day just to see Louise enter the courtroom. On February 17th, she was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was first sent to San Quentin State Prison and later to the California Institution for Women in Tehachapi. While in prison, she was a model inmate, working as a dental assistant, tending the prison garden, and writing for the prison newspaper. Louise's husband, Richard, stood steadfastly by her during the trial and the first 2 years of her sentence, convinced of her innocence. In 1923, Louise persuaded Richard to divorce her so that he would be free to remarry. He agreed, but promised to wait forever for her release. Soon after the divorce, however, Louise stopped answering his letters and refused to see him, and Richard despaired of her indifference and finally committed suicide in an Arizona hotel room in 1924. After serving 18 years, Louise was paroled for good behavior in 1939. Upon her release, she was taken in by Jesse Marcy, who had fought for her release, and began working as her housekeeper. Shortly thereafter, Marcy died of natural causes, and Louise moved into the home of her parole officer, Emily Latham, to work as a nurse and housekeeper before Latham finally died of a heart attack in 1943. Neither of these deaths was investigated in detail, as the police were unaware at the time that Louise had been the subject of a previously publicized murder and was on parole. Louise then moved into the home of Arthur C. Logan, she and his wife Margaret, an elderly couple living in Pacific Palisades. While in prison, she had struck up a friendship with Margaret, a retired social worker who believed in Louise's innocence and fought for her release. They even took care of Louise's daughter during her incarceration. Louise worked for Mr. and Mrs. Logan as a housekeeper and nurse for Arthur, who suffered from age-related dementia and was declared mentally incompetent. She later married Lee Borden Judson, a banker, on May 2, 1944, but she did not disclose to her husband her history of imprisonment for murder. Shortly after Louise began working for the Logan family, she began disclosing to neighbors that Arthur had been physically assaulting her and Margaret on a regular basis. 20 days later, Margaret disappeared, and 3 days after that, Louise took Arthur to Barton State Hospital, claiming to be his foster sister. Louise said that Arthur had attacked his wife in a rage, biting her nose so badly that it was disfigured. When Judson begins to inquire about Margaret's whereabouts, she again states that it was Arthur who attacked his wife, adding that Margaret has gone into hiding to undergo plastic surgery. For the next 6 months, Louise and Judson continued to live at the Logan home, and, as she had with Denton, she began squandering the Logans' money and forging their names on checks. On December 6, 1944, Arthur died at Barton State Hospital. After his death, employees of the Logan Bank discovered a forged check written by Louise and called the police. While investigating the forgery, the police searched the Logan home where Louise and her husband were still living. On December 20th, 1944, 6 months after Margaret's disappearance, police found her decomposing body in a shallow grave under an avocado tree in their backyard. Louise was arrested and charged with murder within hours of the discovery. At trial, Louise claimed that Margaret had been beaten and shot with a blunt object by Arthur, and she admitted burying Margaret, but denied killing her. She said she did not report the murder because she feared she would be blamed for her previous conviction, and an autopsy determined that Margaret had been shot in the back of the neck and had a fractured skull. Judson was also arrested and charged with murder, and both couples maintained their innocence. On January 11, 1945, Judson's murder charge was dropped due to insufficient evidence, and he was released. The next day, he jumped to his death from the 9th floor of the Spring Arcade, an office building in Los Angeles. Upon learning of her husband's death, Louise wept and told a reporter, "It's all my fault. He can't face the shame, but as long as he's associated with me, he'll be famous." Louise's trial opened in Los Angeles on April 23, 1945, with prosecutors suggesting that Louise's motive for killing Margaret was to gain control of her finances. They stated that Louise killed Margaret after the two had an argument over a $200 check that Louise had forged in Arthur's name. And on May 31st, a jury found Louise guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced her to death. As the verdict was announced, Louise was found in the courtroom reading Lin Yutang's book on Chinese philosophy, The Importance of Living. She glanced up briefly, gave the prosecutor a mocking look, and then returned to her reading. After her conviction, she continued to protest her innocence, and after several unsuccessful appeals, she was finally executed in the gas chamber of San Quentin State Prison on April 11, 1947.